morning. I'm Terry Duval, and I'm moderating this session on Catholic mission and identity. It is an honor and my pleasure to introduce to you two of our well-known Asian leaders in the National Asian Pacific Ministry, Father Simon Kim and Cecile Motus. Dr. Simon Kim is a professor of theology and coordinator for the Catholic intellectual tradition. He is the recipient of the Thomas Chambers Endowed Professorship in Theology at Our Lady of Holy Cross College. He completed his doctoral studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. in systematic theology, and his dissertation focused on theology in cross-cultural contexts. Dr. Simon, as what we fondly call him, was born in Seoul, South Korea, and came to the United States at an early age. His own experience of church and identity is the impetus for his theological reflections as he strives to make faith generationally and culturally relevant. His recent publication, Memory and Honor, Cultural and Generational Ministry to Korean American Communities, bridges his theological endeavors and pastoral engagements. His first work, An Immigration of Theology, Theology of Context, as the theological method of Virgilio Elizondo and Gustavo Gutierrez, is a critical investigation of how revelation is rooted in particular peoples, places, and cultures. Father Kim is also a member of the National Ad Hoc Committee for Asian Pacifics of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. And for somebody so young, he brings so much experience to this committee, and so he's a tremendous resource, not only to Korean young adults, but also to this committee that's comprised of Asian Pacific Islanders from across the country. Our second speaker, Cecile Motus, is the former Assistant Director of the Secretariat of Cultural Diversity in the Church of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and its subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Island Affairs. I would like to add that Cecile, in the 13 years that she has served in this capacity, she has competently and tremendously led many initiatives that has contributed to the growth of National Asian Pacific Ministry in the United States. So Cecile brought to this position a wealth of experience. One of these initiatives that she has led resulted in the first and only pastoral letter of the U.S. Catholic Bishops called Asian and Pacific Presence, Harmony in Faith. I think the title of your topic is, the second part becomes the first part. Yeah, this was published by the USCCB in 2001. During her term, additional Asian Pacific Islander communities were added, and at the end of her term, a total of 23 Asian Pacific Islander communities have been gathered, formed, and consulted with. Consultation is very important to Cecile. She brought to this position not only a wealth of experience in the area of pastoral care, but she has worked for more than 30 years in migration and pastoral outreach to immigrants, refugees, as well as in cross-cultural education with international organizations. She served as the Asia Regional Liaison Officer of the International Catholic Migration Commission, which provides services and advocacy for refugees, migrants, and immigrants in more than 90 countries around the world. Among her published works are a set of Hiligaynon language books published by the University of Hawaii for training American Peace Corps volunteers, a cross-cultural orientation manual for Vietnamese refugees resettling in the United States. And she has also written several great articles, magazine articles, on immigrants in parishes. Both Cecile and Father Simon are sought after speakers because of their expertise that they bring to Asian Pacific ministry, which we consider still very young in the United States. Cecile holds a master's degree from the University of Hawaii and the East-West International Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. I present you Father Simon and Cecile were in good hands.
I often get asked, what religious order are you with? And I have to say that I'm with none. I'm a diocesan priest. And it's rare these days that a diocesan priest gets to work outside his diocese at another institution. So I'm very honored and glad to be with you here today. Thank you, Dr. Kavanaugh and my colleagues, because this type of forum, arena, really does support me in my vocation as a priest and theologian. And I'm just very honored to be able to share with you today a glimpse of my own reflection. I hope to give you 3 snapshots. One of the early Christian community, another of the early Korean Christian community, and then finally a snapshot of the Korean American Catholic community as well. And to say, what do these 3 have in common, and how do we define church in the process as well? The struggle for identity arises through the departure from one previous realities into the environs of another. While Jesus was alive, the question of identity for his followers was never in doubt, since Jesus himself considered himself a faithful Jew. Through a physical departure from the past and an embrace of the unknown, does the question of identity arise. This concept was certainly evident among the disciples after Jesus' death, especially when their mission moved them to other locales. In his overview of the early church, Joseph Kelly begins, quote, "In the Act of the Apostles, the evangelist Luke reports how Jesus' disciples, both men and women, including Jesus' mother, got together and determined that Jesus' work on earth must be continued by the community, guided, as Luke says, by the Holy Spirit. But divine assistance did not make this task easy, and Luke shows us a community struggling not just against outsiders, but also searching for its identity." So this identity, the search for it, is perhaps the mission in itself, the nature of what it means to be church, because it was from the very beginning, from the early disciples. The search for identity in all its multifaceted dimension is heightened in Diaspora, because it looks back to the familiarity of the homeland, while at the same time looks forward to the transformation in the new region where roots are being laid. And oftentimes we hear from one another about being part of this country, or being part of another homeland, or being here and there, being neither nor. And this tension, we think that there needs to be a solution, that we have to reach a certain place, but perhaps if we look at the nature of church itself, as a pilgrim church, a church on the move, perhaps this is its own identity and mission as well. And to be comfortable then with this tension that is created. I was educated by disciples of Lonergan, so I bring up Bernard Lonergan here to illustrate some of the movements of the early church. It's ironic that when I was learning this in the classroom, it didn't resonate with me that much, but as I dialogue now with Lonergan in terms of my own cultural context, it seems to make a lot more sense. Or perhaps it's just the professors drilling it in me. But Bernard Lonergan employs four aspects, especially in his work on the way to Nicaea. He talks about the objective, subjective, evaluative, and finally the hermeneutical aspects. And these four show us that there is the movement of the church, of the people, and how we have to go from a gospel narrative to then a narrative that resonates with our own context. And so for the scope of this paper, it is important to understand that Lonergan uses the objective and subjective aspects to illustrate the movement from a biblical milieu to diaspora, from scriptural images of Jesus to dogmatic statements of Christ. The evaluative aspect is our critical reflection on this movement between the objective and the subjective aspects, while the fourth aspect arises because, inevitably, the views one holds about the dogmatic developments will influence one's investigation and interpretation of that development. The old axiom still remains true, that whatever is received after the manner of the receiver. These four aspects, especially the hermeneutical, demonstrate the movement from the Palestinian world to the Gentile world, from the Jewish milieu to Greek-speaking cultures, and from biblical images of Jesus to the philosophical and theological understanding of Christ. Commenting on Lonergan's work, Leo Davis notes, explicitly the councils moved from one kind of clarity about the Son of God contained in Scripture, appealing to undifferentiated human consciousness, to another kind of clarity contained in dogmatic statements directed to differentiated intellectual consciousness. But implicitly, without their fully averting to what they were about, they paved the way for the development of dogma. The explicit movement requires the corresponding implicit movement where the lived experience of the believers affirms the truth of the dogmatic statements as representative of the Gospels. Early Christian expression of their commitment to the faith became aspects to judge the intellectual discourse over who Christ was. In short, the lives of those in a Christian diaspora mattered as much as the theological reflection occurring at the same time. The movement of theological thought must accompany the movement of a people. Through this movement, a hermeneutical lens of early ecclesial communities begins to emerge. So what does the movement and what emerges then from this movement? In the early church, what I call an authentic expression of church, I categorize with three themes or characteristics. And the first is that these communities are rather small to begin with, or they're scattered. The second theme is that there's suffering or sacrifices that they endure for various reasons. And finally, the third is that they must adapt the sacramental life. So in the early Christian church, when you move from the Jewish understanding to the understanding of the Greek-speaking world, you naturally have small communities to begin with, because as the mission of the church grows, the community needs time to develop. There's these small pockets of believers that come together to assist, to nurture, to walk with one another in the faith. But we also know in the early periods of Christianity, they were not always welcome. So before 313 and the Edict of Milan, we know that there were persecutions for various reasons, and then finally empire-wide persecutions. And although these persecutions didn't affect every community in the same way, they have a tendency to force some of these communities to then form smaller or more secretive or scattered populations of believers. This brings to the next theme of martyrdom, or some type of sacrifice involved with these. Because to embrace the newfound belief, these Christian communities had to either renounce certain aspects of their previous world, endure ridicule, or even give up their own lives. And we see that through the martyrs of the early church, that this was not something that was taken just lightly, but that there was truly some type of commitment, conversion, their life movement towards this a new way of believing in Christianity. And finally, that there was an adaptation of the sacramental life, especially when the beginnings, when the Eucharist was part of the bishop's ministry, and that you had to gather around those tables. Sometimes that wasn't always readily available. Or when persecutions happened, this had to be more in hiding, or you could not publicly display your prayers. So there had to be some type of adaptation that went on with the lived reality. And others have commented also just the natural progression when you move from one culture to another. You have to move from one understanding of rituals and language to make it resonate now with the context that you live in. So these are the three characteristics that I would like to trace in Korean Christianity and Korean American Christianity. One, the small scattered communities; two, martyrdom, persecution, or suffering; and three, the adaptation of the sacramental life. Korea is a very unique situation in salvation history. In all other places, there was always the thought that you had to go and bring the good news to other cultures and peoples, that you needed an evangelist, a missionary. But in Korea, that was not the case. There was no one to preach on Korean Peninsula. There was no one to educate, to catechize in this manner. Rather, it was the lay people. It was actually the educated class who were interested in Western culture. They were actually seeking a way of an alternative to the social norms and practices of their time. And rather just to looking to China, they began to look to the Western world. So it was out of curiosity for more of a political and social system that people from the Korean Peninsula went to China and started to uncover works by Jesuits such as Matteo Ricci, and started to talk about how the Western ideals and society could be then in complementing the life on the Korean Peninsula as well. And it's interesting that Dr. Sane yesterday mentioned how the African communities were able to embrace Christianity because of their words or terms for the divine or for God. And this is what was happening in China at the time too. That Matteo Ricci was able to use the Confucian and Chinese concepts of the Lord of Heaven with the Christian God, but which will also lead to eventually the rights controversy and Rome deciding not to move in that direction because of the familiarity with those two. So, but in Korea, the idea of Christianity came over as an intellectual concept. And by reading these texts, they became believers. And so naturally they would have small communities because this was not the norm of how society would operate. It was a system they were bringing in not just as a religious system, but as a social and communal system as well. And as they were bringing these texts in, as they were starting to explain these texts to one another, it needed time for development. And soon you had pockets of believers. But as you had pockets of believers, they were also scattered as well, because eventually with the rights controversy, Christianity and Confucianism seemed incompatible. And so you had to either renounce Christianity and fulfill your filial obligations, your ancestor worship, or you had to give up your ancestor worship and worship only the one true God. And so persecution broke out in the early parts of these communities, and another reason they were scattered and moved into mountainous areas for protection. And all told, through the persecutions, about 8,000 were martyred. It's interesting that Korea is the only place where the Pope goes to beatify. So John Paul II went in the 80s to beatify 103 Korean martyrs, and Pope Francis will go in August to beatify another 124. on Korean soil. So it highlights the uniqueness of Korean evangelization. So we have these small and scattered communities, and they experienced sacrifice, martyrdom, because there was a distinct division between the Confucius thought and Christian thought now. But they also had to adapt to sacramental life, because since they were evangelizing themselves, since the laity believed for themselves, the idea that a clergy or missionary was needed was a foreign concept at the beginning. And so basically, they designated one another for the sacramental life. You will listen to confessions. You will celebrate Mass. And so the early life of the church in Korea was a lay-driven sacramental life. Only later did they realize that they needed clergy. So they invited people, priests from China and eventually from France, to come in to continue that on. But there was an interesting gap from their realization of the need for a priest, for clergy, and the arrival of clergy. They did not abandon their lay practices. Rather, they felt that it was more important for the laity to continue these sacramental practices, to nurture the faith until the arrival, than to go without. And so it's a unique beginning, not just in terms of evangelization, but how the liturgical life develops in Korea as well. We see similar developments now in my area that I focus on, is in the Korean American Catholic experience. Now, the Korean immigration is well over 100 years now to the US, and is usually broken up into 3 phases. The last phase, the post-1965 phase, is what is of interest here, because the other 2 groups or waves did not reach enough size or consciousness to continue their cultural heritage or religious identity. But most of the Korean American Catholics that you encounter today are from the post-1965 immigration. And it's also how the Spirit had moved the world for the United States to open up its borders in '65 with the Immigration Act, but also in the terms of the Church with Vatican II as well. So you have 2 forces coming together to create now a people, Korean American Catholics. So when the Korean Americans came to the United States, they formed communities, obviously, that would be small, because they went out of economic need. There was need for coming from a war-torn area, from an impoverished country, to now go to a land where they would have economic success. So location was not necessarily at first by climate or desired living, but it was strictly out of survival needs. And so as these first wave in 1965 came here, they sought areas where they could have the best economic opportunities. And as they were settling in, they realized that the need for their spiritual and communal relations as well. So naturally, these would create smaller pockets in less metropolitan areas. In rural areas, you would have pockets of Koreans that could interact with one another. On top of that, as Catholics, we're in the minority, so you would have even a lower percentage of people coming together. So these small scattered communities were very evident in the post-1965 immigration. Also, these immigrants also had to bring the faith with them. Unlike European immigration, where the clergy came with the people, Koreans traveled without their clergy and had to nurture the faith themselves. And so they were the ones to come together and designate their Catholic communities. They were the ones trying to look for places where they will be welcome, or just simply gather in homes. And so much like the Korean Peninsula a century before, they were the ones really nurturing the faith here in the US as well. Now the critical part comes in is, how do we account for martyrdom or sacrifice then with immigrant groups? Especially today, we hear some places where violence still occurs, but what about in places like the US where we don't have so-called martyrs? And I refer to this as there's sacrifice in other ways. And the main way the Koreans sacrificed when they first came here was through gratification and postponing it to a later time. That they would be willing to subject themselves to long hours of employment, to harsh living conditions, to neighborhoods that they weren't feeling necessarily secure in. But that was their way of sacrificing in a similar nature, in a similar manner, in order for their communities, whether internally in the homes or in the churches, to grow as well. So it's very evident in the Korean community that there's this idea that there needs to be sacrifice. Even in immigrants today who come from a very a better situation from Korea, with more resources, there still is this feeling of the need to sacrifice when you come as immigrants. And so we can make some parallels, to the church facing martyrdom, that the sacrifice today is their own way of allowing this theme to continue on as an authentic expression of church. And finally, because they came in small pockets, you needed sacramental adaptation. Now, they didn't do like the Koreans on the peninsula and say, you're designated to hear confessions or you're designated to celebrate the Eucharist, but they did have to find unique ways of nurturing their sacramental faith life because the clergy did not travel with them. So sometimes you saw communities where they would go to an English-speaking community, and it would be an opposite about like the children's liturgy of the word, right? So they would instead of the children being dismissed, they would be dismissed, and they would share the word amongst themselves in the Korean language, come back and celebrate the Eucharist together with the wider community. Or that they would have an English-speaking priest celebrate the Eucharist, and they would respond in Korean. Or that they simply would wait till a Korean priest came by, and they would celebrate Eucharist once a month. So very similar to what the early church had to adapt with in terms of that. And many of the missionaries from the United States that went to Korea, the Marino and the Columbans, they were the ones who would come back and then start the first communities as well. It was also interesting last night when Dr. Sane mentioned how colonialism itself was the hurdle, became the barrier to Christianity taking off in Africa. And I started to reflect, because once the French missionaries came into Korea, this lay community was very stagnant. It didn't grow much in the early part of the 19th century. But the church really took off when the foreign missioners were able to hand over the church to the lay or to the native clergy. And once they left Korea, that it really took off. But these missionaries also came and started the communities here, and once they handed over the churches to Korean clergy or Korean American now ordained here, now we see some growth as well. So there's an interesting dynamic that seems to, that they bring on the faith to the people, but in some ways it's when they leave that the faith really takes off as well. And we saw that in the Korean American community, that very interesting ways these communities developed and the way they practiced and shared their faith. And today, because of the explosion of Catholicism in Korea and the increase of vocations, most of the communities have their own priests, which was not the case when they first came here. But the difficulty is that 70 to 80% are still staffed by Korean priests that do not come over as immigrants, but as missionaries. And one of the failings we did as our community was not to recognize them as missionaries, but to just see ourselves as extensions. And perhaps that's one of the shortcomings of the diaspora, is that we fail to see how we are created in a new way, and that we just see ourselves as extensions still of the homeland. So last year, November, we made a historic decision. We decided to name ourselves. Rather than saying we're extensions of Korea, we're immigrants, we decided that we should always be called Korean American Catholics. not Korean Catholics, but Korean American Catholics. And to distinguish now that there is a new development with the Korean American people here. And this is important because when you trace our roots back, we go as far back as the Korean War and the poverty, but since then we have developed very differently. And if we don't recognize ourselves as different people, then the way we minister or the way we receive foreign clergy, much tension arises in that complication. The other reason we as a community decided to name ourselves is that we wanted to be all-inclusive. How do you determine who comes tomorrow versus who is born here as the same people? And this was kind of thrust upon us by the 2010 census. Since the 2000 census, the US government has been keeping track of mixed marriages. And so in the church, we've only seen Korean American Catholics mainly as those who are born of 2 Korean parents. But in the census, we found out that people now are identifying themselves as Korean American Catholics, regardless of whether they were born from 2 Korean parents. So for mixed marriages, this population has drastically increased. So they are also forcing us to redefine ourselves. And I think in this dynamic, we find an interesting emergence of a new creation. But is it enough for us to just have those 3 characteristics, those 3 themes? Small and scattered communities, sacrifice for martyrdom, and sacramental adaptation. How do we evaluate, as Lonergan says, those aspects of the subjective movement? And how do we know our hermeneutical lens now is correct? So I would like to conclude with a little critique of this. The 3 characteristics, small or scattered communities of believers, suffering or sacrifice to the point of martyrdom, and adaptation in the sacramental life in the beginnings of the faith community, demonstrate Lonergan's movement from the objective to the subjective aspect of faith. Although all 3 communities described here reveal these characteristics, it is not enough for nascent communities of faith to similarly imitate or contain within themselves these traits. The reasons for being scattered, enduring suffering, and requiring sacramental adaptation must be carefully assessed in regards to the evaluative aspect in order to gain a proper hermeneutical perspective. Therefore, the evaluative aspect becomes a key component in realizing the authenticity of the content of faith being lived and handed on. Without the evaluative, it will be too easy for us to over-glorify nascent communities of faith in diaspora because of their characteristics without making any critical evaluations of whether or not the lived reality is truly reflective of the lived reality of Jesus Christ. Thus, the characteristics of the faith life in diaspora, small, scattered communities, sacrificing even unto death, and adaptation of the sacramental life are not simply enough. Only through an honest critique which produces an authentic perspective on living out the faith in church and society do these characteristics found in diaspora reveal the emergence of a new creation through their subjective expression as an authentic church. An honest critique reveals a commonality of both Koreans and Korean Americans, that is, the materially oriented concerns within the lived experience of the Christian faith. Although causes for this concern can be explained through social or religious conditioning, material accumulation beyond the poverty of the past is a primary focus for both groups and enshrined within the spiritual realm. Certain notions of material blessings as indicators of spiritual well-being can be traced to shamanic influences on Korean belief. Similarly, the European experience of the Protestant Reformation also has influenced the outlooks of both the Korean and Korean Americans. To critique this subjective aspect of material accumulation, further testified by the immigration experience, Brad Gregory's Unintended Reformation sheds some valuable light on the identification of material success as an outward expression of spiritual blessings common among both Catholic and Protestant faithful in the homeland and this diaspora. A very European model of Christianity, interpreted through the U.S. Protestant experience, became the foundation for religious expression. Growing initially through the evangelization and rebuilding of Korean society by both Protestants and Catholic missionaries in the 20th century, the Korean faith was greatly influenced by the European model of Christianity. In addition to being influenced by the West through evangelization, Korean Americans magnified the influences of the Protestant ethos by their immigration to the U.S. For Korean American Catholics to recognize their place within salvation history, a critical examination of these influences is needed to see if the subjective aspects of their communal life are authentic expressions of the notions of community with this hallmark of sacrifice and adaptation. According to Gregory, the Protestant Reformation ruptured the fabric of European society, thereby creating a void in the abilities of Europeans to answer life questions, centered around one's existence, meaning, and purpose. Thus, the Reformation did not just divide Catholics and Protestants, but it also unintentionally led to a society searching for answers that the church could no longer provide because of the lack of authority regulated to the Catholic Church and the relevantizing of scriptural interpretation among Protestants themselves. To bridge this rupture and to lay to rest the restlessness caused by life questions, the inability to answer questions revolving around one's existence, Gregory insists that the material wealth became one measure or guide in living out a purpose-driven life. Thus, material measures of the spiritual life entered into the equation in understanding one's faith, whereby the material accumulation became an overarching indicator of one's spiritual wholeness. Gregory thus states, quote, "Anxious self-scrutiny about one's status in God's eyes thus generated the Reformed Protestants' inner worldly asceticism, characterized by self-consciousness, hard work, diligence, self-discipline, and frugality that seems to betoken elect status in proportion as such virtues were consistently practiced. The behaviors driven by this Protestant ethic also generated wealth and profits, especially among English Puritans, which in turn contributed to a sense of God's individually tailored providential favor." Unquote. It is not by coincidence or by accident that emphasis on the material is strongly demonstrated in the lives of Koreans and Korean Americans today. Material success is very much a part of Korean and Korean American measure of not only social advancement and achievement, but also so in terms of religious well-being. In a shamanic culture, material or worldly well-being is the result of spiritual harmony created by honoring one's ancestors. In the Protestant ethos upon which the U.S. was built, hard work and individual effort create material well-being. Having inherited both these concepts of materialism, Korean and Korean Americans have heightened their accumulation for material wealth, not just to ease the painful memories of an impoverished country for most of the past century, but also to signal prosperity from individual hard work and persistence, in turn making material gain pseudo-spirituality. The need to evaluate critically the movement of theological thought and peoples in producing an authentic and meaningful hermeneutic perspective must be taken seriously. A modern theological reflection of Korean and Korean American faith development, as well as postmodern critique of a subjective aspect common in both, promotes an evaluative aspect in which a renewed understanding of sacrifice of immigrants and their offspring can sometimes create an authentic, as well as an inauthentic reflection of the objective portrait of Christ's own sacrifice, or martyrdom of the early church. Only in this critique does a proper hermeneutical aspect arise, aligning our lives as an authentic expression of church. In doing so, a new creation of faith in Diaspora is set to develop due to the emergence of a personal and communal identity grounded in the present reality, truly reflecting the lived reality of Jesus Christ and the traditions handed on. Part of my investigation was because in my work on the pastoral level and theologically as well was that we always seem to refer to church as some fully organized community with parish structures, diocesan structures, and we always seem to relegate faith communities in diaspora as something less than church. And by looking at an authentic expression of church, those three themes, we can say they are fully church as well. And that those structures, the hierarchy, those models that we've inherited from Europe are not necessarily just the fullness of church. And so as we look to these diaspora communities, we have to realize we are the full expression of church as well. Thank you very much.
I need to set up. Thank you, Iris. Thank you, Father Simon, for providing the context, actually, in terms of the movement of immigrant groups and the history of Christianity in Korea, so that I'm able to then focus on what has happened to the Asian Pacific Islander Catholics who are now here in the Catholic Church in the United States. I thought I would just focus on the pastoral aspect, what's happening in the level of the national as well as the diocesan responses to the need to maintain faith, deepen faith, and the need to continue to maintain cultural identity and interaction with church. I thought I'd start with some data, mainly because I felt very excited. Dr. Andreas, in his presentation, mentioned how difficult it is to get data about Catholic population in the country. The USCCB, Secretariat for Cultural Diversity in the Church, commissioned CARA, the Center for Research, Applied Research at Georgetown University, in 2013. And the purpose was really, they wanted to see the size, distribution, and location of various Catholic populations in the country. And CARA came up with these figures based on research that they did with about 800 plus parishes in the country. So my putting it up there is mainly because in the past we've always thought, oh, Asian Pacific Catholics, they're really a very tiny, tiny group. This research has shown that we may be tiny, but we are also quite big. We're the third, we look at it, we're the third largest Catholic population in this country today. And who were counted among the Asians in the study that was done? The Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Koreans, thank you, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, the Indians, and the Japanese. These are the bigger immigrant community and rooted communities in the United States, or what we would call Asian Americans, although it's very difficult to say Asian because many of us do not think we are Asian. I think I'm Filipino American, and Father would say he's Korean American. So it's very difficult to generalize, but again, we have to start from some commonalities that we see among us. The study also showed that in 80, I'm sorry, not this study, but an informal study that we commissioned, the Secretariat commissioned when I was still working there in 2011. There's an unpublished study. We wanted to find out where are the Asian Catholics and what kinds of ministries are provided and who are counted in parishes and dioceses as Asian. And interesting results of that study came out with 29 Asian communities identified to be outreached by various dioceses, whether it's liturgy, Mass every Sunday, or Mass one Sunday a month, or a Bible study class, or catechesis in the native language, youth programs, and so on and so forth. So I thought this was really important in terms of the pastoral planning of outreach to Asian and Pacific Catholics. And we are in these dioceses in numbers. CARA came out with this. I know this is undercounted because CARA based its count on the 2010 census. So we know that there are more than what appears in these figures. I was just in the Diocese of San Bernardino last week. They wanted their Asian Pacific Ministry Program evaluated, and I brought the figures from the CARA study and the diocesan figures. There was a discrepancy of more than 5,000 numbers of Asians present in the diocese. But this gives us a basis for looking at pastoral care and ministry and mission to these pockets of what Father Simon says, scattered in small communities all over the United States. Dr. Ansel Min, who is a Korean-American theologian, he was invited to a symposium before the bishops wrote the pastoral statement, Asian and Pacific Presence, Harmony and Faith. There was a symposium for bishops about Asian Pacific Catholics. And in his paper he read at that symposium, he said that ecclesial life of these Asian Pacific communities in the United States is a reflection of ecclesial life in the home countries, which in turn was shaped not only by their cultural characteristics, but also the kind of Catholicism that was introduced to Asian countries during the last 5 centuries. Father Simon mentioned the Christianization of Korea and the beginnings of Christianity through the efforts and interest of intellectual Koreans at that time. The experience of other Asian countries, especially the Philippines, Vietnam, China, is a bit different because of the colonization experience and the growth of Christianity after Christianization was inculturated in these countries. The presence of Asian Christians and Catholics in particular has then transferred to the United States what many Asian scholars and theologians now refer to as Asianized forms of Christianity. And I think, when I was preparing this paper for this gathering, I was saying, whoa, World Catholicism and the impact of Asian Christians and Catholics to the church in this country. What are the characteristics of these Asianized forms of Christianity? Both blessing as well as big challenges to the church. Father Simon has mentioned several in terms of differences in loyalty or ecclesiology, and according to Father Peter Phan, Vietnamese theologian, and I looked at the pastoral statement of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines regarding the marks of spirituality of Filipino Catholics. I put together or collated this list. It's not comprehensive in any way, but it gives us a flavor of what we mean when we say Asian forms of Christianity, based on, first, Asian in spirit. And I'll go into more detail later. The church, to many Asians and many immigrants, is not just a place of worship. The church is a center for community life and really a source for identity building. Very important, because many of the Asian Pacific Catholics want to maintain their cultural identity while navigating Catholic identity as they integrate into the Catholic Church in this country. The planting and flowering of vocations in the Asian Catholic communities, characteristic of devout popular religiosity across all of our Asian groups, especially a Marianist devotion. Our devotion to our Blessed Mother. We have Our Lady of Lavang, Our Lady of Korea, Our Lady of Vietnam, Our Lady of Peace and Good Voyage for the Filipinos. And there are many feasts and many celebrations which mark the feast day of this celebration of our Blessed Virgin. Formed by the cross, and I won't go into that. Father Kim has mentioned that and described it very well. Institutional, a high value, a high recognition of the respect of our clergy, as well as the hierarchy in the church. And then individualistic piety, the challenge of living faith, including concern for social justice and solidarity with the poor and solidarity with the suffering. Let me go to Asian spirit. The state of life that God intended, based on Asian spirituality and Asian values, harmony is number one. We'll do whatever it takes to maintain complementarity and harmony. And the rest of it follow. From there, filial piety, thirst for learning and philosophical inquiry, the sense of the sacred. Asia gave birth to all, if not most, of the religions of the world, including the cultural, the religious traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and the animist religious traditions. And so many of the Asians have already in themselves, I know Professor Sane last night talked about, it's already in you. Faith is already in you because we grow up in the milieu of all of these values, human values, and all of the sayings and practices of being compassionate, being thrifty, being persistent, and so on and so forth. The second characteristic is, to many Asians, church is home and opportunity for preservation of ethnic diversity. According to Dr. Min, the church serves as a haven and shelter from slings and arrows of immigrant life in a strange culture, where they can gather among their own kind, share their own stories of frustration, pain, and struggle in a language they don't have to strain to understand, and a manner they don't have to learn. As minorities under constant threat of assimilation and discrimination, the church communities serve well as sources of identity, consolation, and hope. With this in mind, Asian Catholics really want this maintenance of cultural identity while also deepening their identity as Catholics, American Catholics. The challenges posed to mission and ministry to these groups of Americans is what appropriate pastoral responses which reflect Asian American concerns and cater to the needs, especially the need to worship and pray in the native language, the need to practice religion in their cultural idiom, and the need for community building. And to respond to the call of Gaudium et Spes, when it says a parish life is to present the doctrine of the church concerning God, man, and the world in a manner more adapted to them, so that they may receive it more willingly. In many of the Asian and Pacific groups, prevalent especially among the Vietnamese, the Koreans, and the Chinese, to maintain identity, cultural identity as well as religious identity, the parishes or the missions to these communities have what is called schools of religion and culture. Mainly because, and I quote again, the need coming from the Korean church, many Korean families attend Korean churches because these churches contribute to maintaining Korean identity by helping preserve Korean cultural traditions through Korean language liturgies, Korean language study programs for their American-born children, the celebration of Korean traditional and national holidays, fellowship meetings where members partake of Korean traditional food, and the emphasis of traditional Korean Confucian values such as filial piety, thrift, and perseverance as preached by Korean pastors. So, what has the church in the United States done to respond to this need for maintaining cultural and religious identity, and at the same time integration into the Catholic Church in the United States? The structures that have been used, I'm not saying one is better than the other or whatever, but in history and at present, the structures that are used to reach out and provide pastoral care to Asian Catholics are the following. In many dioceses in this country, personal parishes have been revived because most bishops do not believe that there is a need for personal parishes or national parishes because of what happens after the community has matured or moved to the suburbs, and we had experience of closing churches because of the lack of parishioners. However, in some dioceses, many of the some bishops have allowed for the creation of personal parishes, especially for Vietnamese, Koreans, Chinese, and where there are no churches or groups which cannot afford to build or create personal parishes, missions have been created for groups like the Cambodians. There is no priest who speaks Cambodian in this country. Neither do we have a priest who speaks Lao or Hmong. And wonderful thing that has happened with the Hmong is they have grown, the missionaries who came with them have developed deacons. We have 11 Hmong deacons in different parts of the country ministering with their people. In many parishes in the country today, multicultural parish, which pays attention, either provides space, liturgy, some form of social ministry to particular ethnic communities. Multicultural parishes are there and will continue to be there. Side by side, we have ministry with the Hispanics. We have ministry with African Americans, ministry with the Filipinos, with the Vietnamese. I was in Milwaukee for their celebration. It's St. Michael Parish in Milwaukee. In that parish, there are several ethnic communities which worship. European Americans, Hispanics, they have Hmong, they have Lao, and they have Vietnamese, and of course Filipinos. And their liturgy, parish liturgy committee, has started, I think about 5-6 years ago, to put together music which incorporated 6 languages. We sing, for example, all are welcome in the church. And every verse has been translated. The first verse in English, the second verse in Vietnamese, the third in Tagalog, and so on and so forth. The parish also has catechesis in Hmong, in Lao, in Spanish, and in English. So there are these multicultural parishes all over the country which have accommodated and really recognize the presence of the variety of diverse Catholics in the parish boundaries. Then the last model of response is the intercultural or shared parish. Recently, this description of what is happening in parishes has been put forward by some theologians studying parish life, and the USCCB has adopted this in its training for intercultural competency for ministers, which from a multicultural parish side by side, there are moments in church life where there are reflections and sharings together of the diverse groups in the parish. So what opportunities open for mission and identity building so that Asian Pacifics Catholics have been able to contribute, give their gifts to the church in the United States, and the idea of recognizing the gifts and presence of diversity in our local churches is put forward. At USCCB, a pastoral statement, Terry mentioned it earlier, a pastoral statement for Asian and Pacific Islanders, harmony in faith, presence of Asian and Pacific Islanders in the United States, was promulgated by the bishops in 2001. Interestingly, when we wrote the first draft of the pastoral statement, when the bishops wrote the first draft of the pastoral statement and made its way to all the bishops, one line there was, perhaps the slow growth of ministry to Asian Pacifics is there because there are no Asian American bishops in the hierarchy. That was the first draft. By the time the third draft came to be, 3 Asian American bishops were elevated to the episcopate. So in the last draft that was approved and passed by the conference, that line was changed already. Oops. It's okay. So the second thing with USCCB response is, look at my watch, is that in 2008, thank you, the bishops came up with 5 priorities for the life of the church in this country. And one of the priorities was identified as recognition of cultural diversity in the church, especially the presence of Hispanic Catholics. So because of this goal in church life, the conference decided to organize a secretariat or a department of cultural diversity in USCCB based in Washington, D.C. The department now has bishops, subcommittee of bishops, which pay attention to the pastoral needs of Hispanics, Hispanic Catholics, the pastoral need of Native Americans, Asian and Pacific Catholics, the needs of African American Black Catholics, and this one group which catches everybody else, not belonging to any of the 4, which includes new arrivals from Europe, from Brazil, from Africa, especially the continent of Africa, and as well as travelers, circus, migrant workers, seafarers, and all of these ministries are all of the people who are traveling or moved someplace because of the nature of their occupation. With this, what the bishops did was to elevate attention, especially to the Asian Pacific Catholics, which before then was an office under the Department of Migration and Refugee Services. But Asian and Pacific Catholics have been knocking on the door of the bishops, on the doors of the bishops, saying, we are no longer immigrants and refugees. Many of us have been here for at least a century. We are rooted Americans and rooted Catholics. So we will require pastoral care, not just assistance, but we will contribute our gifts as Asian American Catholics, Filipino American Catholics, Vietnamese American Catholics, and so on and so forth. Another manifestation of the contributions and acceptance of the presence of Asian Catholics in the United States is the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., has more than 30 shrines of various images of our Blessed Mother from Poland, from Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and so on. Among these shrines are now Our Lady of Bailangkani of the Indians, Our Lady of Antipolo, Our Lady of Good Voyage of the Filipinos, Our Lady of Kamalen of the Romanian Catholics, Our Lady of China, which is a mosaic in one of the doors, and Our Lady of Korea. So there is a symbol of recognition, especially in a national church, of this presence. In addition, the devotees of our Blessed Mother have annual pilgrimages to the National Basilica. The Filipinos go there, the Indians, the Chinese, and there are pilgrimages in many of the shrines in the United States by Asian Catholics to devote celebration and time for our Blessed Mother. Simbang Gabi is a novena of masses during Advent, celebrated by the Filipino Catholics. An informal survey many years ago indicated that about 1,000 parishes in the country practice or celebrate Simbang Gabi. About 2 years ago, we did an informal survey again, and the number of parishes have grown. More than 2,000 parishes celebrate Simbang Gabi. What is it? We have masses for 9 nights before Christmas in preparation for the birth of Jesus. It's a way of accompanying Mary in her preparation for the birth of Jesus. And we celebrate with masses in our parish churches. While I was working in the Bishops' Conference, there were many pastors who were interested in celebrating Simbang Gabi, European American pastors, even if they had only 1 or 2 or 3 Filipino families, because it was a way of really preparing for the arrival of Jesus Christ. And I used to send literature about Simbang Gabi and suggestions on how to celebrate it. And the beauty is, in many dioceses today, in preparation for celebrating Simbang Gabi, the Filipino community works with the Diocesan Office of Liturgy to prepare the masses and get the enculturation of the celebration in place. In some cases, the Filipinos and the Hispanics have banded together to do posadas and then Simbang Gabi in their parishes. I would like to end here because I think we need time to talk about your questions and issues that you may have regarding the presence and the impact of Asian Catholics in the church in this country. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. Asian American Catholics are here and will continue to impact the Catholic Church in their Asianized forms of Christianity. Their presence is both opportunity and challenge to the Church. These varied Catholic faithful have persisted in the practice of their faith, have given their many gifts to the local church, and continue to pray and hope for a more permanent seat at the table, along with the other brothers and sisters from other cultural backgrounds now very active in the church. Our prayer Asian and Pacific Catholics is, our prayer is that together, all the people of God will grow and continually renew the church in this country with the many gifts that they bring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile and Father Simon. Your presentations were very informative. If you have any questions, please go to the standing microphone. But before we start the open forum, which we are going to have for a duration of 15 minutes, I'd like to show you the pastoral letter that Cecile talked about. And this is the first and the only pastoral letter that was written by the bishops to welcome and to recognize Asian and Pacific presence in the United States. Actually, we started this millennium with this pastoral letter. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for your presentations. So I was recently reading some of the documents from the FABC, the Federation of Asian Bishops Conference, and so they frame sort of the church's mission as a triple dialogue with the poor, with other cultures, and with other religions. And so I was wondering, to what extent do you think that framework is helpful for Asian Americans and the church here? And to what extent is that not helpful?
In fact, there is a section in the pastoral statement which refers to that and the wisdom of the Asian bishops thinking about dialogue, first of all, the process of dialogue, and the dialogue with cultures, religions, and the poor. I think we recognize in the Asian Catholic community the need to learn about ourselves, first of all, and to cross cultural boundaries so that within the Asian population, Asian Catholic population, we get to know the Indian American Catholics, the Korean American Catholics. So there are in several dioceses now gatherings which bring together these various Asian cultures. In the Diocese of San Bernardino, they celebrate annually for the last 9 years now a youth day where they bring 7 different cultures into that day, and youth ranging from 13 to 17 years old. In Milwaukee, they celebrate Asian Catholic Day. In Dallas, they have an Asian Day. So there are activities which encourage us to get to know each other, as well as look at each other as support for growth of our communities, as well as integration into the church and into general society. One of the problems we have, not problems, but stumbling block, is this individualistic piety and the thinking that we are not yet at the level where we are present in many of the advocacy opportunities for the poor and for the vulnerable populations.
And to throw another layer into the mix is that not only do we have to know the different Asian groups, but culturally, generationally within ourselves, there needs to be that dialogue that hasn't been taking place as well. And so that we can dialogue with the Asian bishops. And because the context is shifting and changing. And so in Diaspora, it's that looking back to the homeland, but it doesn't always resonate. And so by the investigation of who we are, then I think we can have a more fruitful conversation.
Can I say something about that? Because I work in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and I'm very much involved in these 3 aspects. And as you might know, the dialogue sets the context of the realities that people experience in Asia, which are different cultures, different religions, and the poor. So when it comes to establishing priorities in relation to this triple dialogue, I find ecumenism, which would be the different religions, is still one part that we really need to ingrain in the psyche of many immigrants, because many of them are on a survival mode. They are just concerned about their own communities and about the second generation. Do they have bread, shelter, and so on for survival. In terms of cultures, the different Asian communities are different cultures in themselves, then expose them to other cultures, Western cultures, European, Middle Eastern, and so on. Again, this was referred to in terms of negotiating identities. There's still paddling their canoes, trying to look for what is the best way. First of all, these are impact points when you're talking about parishes or about the scattered communities. Which environments do they have to interact with? What are their role sets in the neighborhood, especially because of violence and other kinds of practical things to consider. When it comes to the poor, you will find many of our communities, Asian communities, working with Catholic relief services, and these communities are actually fundraisers for, like, the typhoon in the Philippines, the earthquake in Japan, the tsunami earthquake in Japan, and India, whatever is going on. However, what we found out is that there are many Americans and many missionaries who are spearheading these fundraisers, actually. And so we find many of our lay leaders being introduced to a newer concept of looking at the poor. Many of them don't want to be identified with the poor because they're surviving themselves. But many of our doctors and nurses are members, they go on medical missions, they go to these countries where we have these disasters. And so there's a tremendous number of resources now that we are listing under what services do we have from Asian communities that are specifically for the poor. So we're starting actually in our own environments. What do we see as part of our realities that are becoming part of our identities in our own parishes, in our worshiping environments? Any other question?
So, Koreans are not Japanese, and Vietnamese are not Chinese, and oftentimes there's very fraught history, between different groups. Do Asian people ever resent being lumped together as Asian? And what is the effect of being in? I mean, we would think it would be absurd to lump Germans and French together and say, let's have a celebration of European, culture or something like that. But yet, Asian people are kind of put together in these categories. Does that create tensions? What is the effect of being in diaspora on that? Does that exacerbate those tensions? Does it lessen those tensions?
I just had a conversation recently where a person from Spain said, what do you guys have in common that you would be grouped together like this? And the only thing is that government, the census has grouped us this way, and the Bishops' Conference has taken on these categories as well. And this came to light because we are working on a Asian and Pacific Island pastoral plan like the Hispanics have done and the Black Catholics have done as well. And one of the challenges is that we have no commonality. We do not share language, we do not share culture, and yet there's some 48 groups that are trying to put together a pastoral plan that's supposed to resonate with everyone. So in diaspora, it gets, like you say, is exacerbated because now you're not just talking about one community, now we're lumped together because of a governmental category that we have to work in. But the other fruit of that is, we really have a sense that this is a Pentecost experience. That the Spirit is moving us together to say, beyond your natural categories of commonality, how can we come together as church? And so we see different communities coming to work together. And recently the Filipino, Korean, and the Vietnamese Priest Alliance has formed to work together and to get to know each other's communities. Because we have been independently surviving here in the US. Now that we're at our stage where we can reflect and contribute, we are now trying to work together knowing that there is no other way of doing this. And so we see signs of hope, and even that's our gift, is furthering what it means to be church. What does the Pentecost experience mean to us? It's not just a reflection of what happened in the past, but we are living the Pentecost experience today, and that's our gift to the wider church.
Can I respond again? As somebody working in the Archdiocese, this would be more of your part of your environment here. In the Archdiocese of Chicago, we have one strategic pastoral plan for the whole church, which is all-inclusive, and it's called to reflect Christ's light. Every year, a priority has been designated, such as like the first year, which was 5 years ago, the first priority was on youth and young adults. For the second year, we had the year of the Sunday Eucharist. This year, we have the year of strong Catholic families. Next year, it's going to be the year of the sacrament. Now, encompassing all of this is parish transformation. You must have heard about a big project that's going on with parishes that would have to reflect changes as a result of working on these priorities. So what we have found out, because I deal with diverse Asian communities, is we're going to look at how can we incorporate every individual Asian community in this Archdiocesan pastoral plan so that we continue to contribute our talents and gifts to this church, and we continue to enrich the life of the church here, not only in the Archdiocese of Chicago, but in America. But from previous sessions, we have learned that negotiating identity is one of the key challenges, and one would need to have, I think, a very good background on psychology, anthropology, sociology, to understand all of these, because communities do not understand integration as one concept. There are many layers of it. Then you have also to look at what are the subgroups in these communities, when did they immigrate, and so on. So we need scholars like, Father Kim, Cecile, and all our speakers to help us really understand what the dynamics is that we're talking about here. People seem to have a certain solution, one big solution, for a very complex situation. But as people of God, we always say as people of God, I think God meant it to be that way, for us to be complex communities, and that's how we discover the beauty and the holy and the sacred in dealing with many of these communities and in dealing with church. That's a very good question.
Well, just a follow-up on the previous question, but which is a comment that perhaps scholars and the practitioners that we must be wary of creating or inventing diasporas. Particularly, I think you have said perhaps Asians don't see themselves as Asians, rather Filipinos or Korean, and which is quite certainly, I think, important. I think when we think of religious sort of diasporas, whether they are diasporas or perhaps we are creating diasporas. But I think my question that I have, which Motus you have actually raised, is on Asianized forms of Christianity. I think the question will be, I think, and the tension that is there is, how do you maintain these rooted forms of attachment to Asian forms of Christianity, or these bounded forms of identity? At the same time, you want to be open to the world, to be open to the global or Catholic, which is much more transnational. How do we hold on to both?
Let me respond with two things. My experience with Filipino American Catholics, mainly because we have many communities in multicultural churches. One of the things the Filipino American Catholics do is to bring bishops from the Philippines to be teachers when we gather together, whether it's for charismatic groups. There's an annual meeting of the Alliance of Filipino Charismatic Prayer Groups, which gather about 3,000, 4,000 pastoral leaders from all over the country. We have the Couples for Christ movement. This is another thing I didn't have time to mention. Movements among the Asian Catholics. We have the Couples for Christ movement, which when they gather annually, Couples for Christ, Singles for Christ, Kids for Christ, and Handmaids of the Lord, and you know, in all the generations that Father was talking about, we bring in Filipino bishops and Filipino theologians, aside from speakers from the American church, to keep our Filipino spirituality alive, and to nurture that through the input of bishops as well as charismatic priest speakers or lay people from the home country. That's one. The second thing is, because of the ease of transportation these days, again, there's this term now that's coming out, transnational Catholicism, where because of travel from one country to the next, we're able to bring what we learn from one country to wherever we are. Many Filipino American Catholics go back to the Philippines, participate in Catholic gatherings there, formation programs, pilgrimages, and so on. So this spirituality and dual, what I think Professor Sana said last night about the dual sovereignty of divine sovereignty and national sovereignty, that's going on in many of in many Asian groups here in the country. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Well, we're 5 minutes.
Will you accept one more question?
Oh, one more question.
I just wanted Father Kim to, I was captivated by the idea of that prosperity was so essential, or is so essential to the spiritual development of the Korean person, and I was just wondering if you could say more about that.
In Korean culture, the shamanistic belief that the physical world is associated with the spiritual world. So the reason why you have ancestor worship, you have visiting a gravesite and so forth, is always to appease the spiritual realm. And that appeasement then translates into material well-being as well. So underlining just society in general, you have this connection that your material blessings are not just your own, but it's also a sign of your spiritual blessing. On top of that, then we have what Gregory is saying is happening through the Protestant Reformation, is that material wealth is becoming a sign of our spiritual well-being in Christianity as well. And Korea gets a double dose of this because you have the missionaries in the early 19th century who came, Protestant and Catholic, from the United States, who inherited this ethos of material blessing and brought it into Korea through the missionary activity. And then Koreans coming to the United States, and then as they develop here as Korean Americans, getting another layer of understanding that really our material blessings is providential, it's a spiritual blessing, it's from God. And this message then resonates strongly because you already have the cultural underpinning of it. And the critique we have to make is that we all talk about our diaspora experience, but we have to say, is it truly an authentic expression of what was been handed down? And that, I was talking to Dr. Sane before that, it's for Koreans, it'd be ludicrous not to connect it to. It's so ingrained in us that you don't even raise the question. But I think we need to raise the question because if we think that church has these elements of small communities, of sacrifice, then what gives them authenticity versus just another secular community? And so as we evaluate that, then we get a perspective of how then to live our lives going forward with that. But it's really ingrained both socially and religiously within the Korean and Korean American people. This idea that material wealth is a sign of both the spiritual well-being.
Thank you. And thank you, Mike. We're ending this session now. So thank you very much to our speakers, especially